Most graphic designers would agree that fonts are an important part of the aesthetic of a website. And yet the technical details for getting fonts into a website have not always been very easy. So in this lecture, what I would like to talk about is the ways in which web fonts are brought into a computer, into a web page, via the HTML and CSS code. So this is web fonts. My name is Don Patterson. At a high level, what I'd like to communicate in this lecture is that fonts on the web used to be very hard to work with, and that Google has really set the standard for providing legal and widely available fonts for web pages. And I'd like to show you how you can leverage their work in order to bring a good quality font into your website. Fonts are really legally quite a pain. It turns out that being able to use a font requires you to obtain rights to be able to use the font in any kind of a publication. In much the same way that if you would like to use an image that someone else took, a photo that someone else took, you need to obtain rights to that photo from the rights holder, usually the photographer, before you can use it in publications commercially. It turns out that the very first US design patent that was ever issued was for a typeface in 1842. It's actually a series of 4 different typefaces, one of which was called double pica. It turns out that design patents cover ornamental aspects of a design, and they last for 15 years. So in this way, someone who has an aesthetic approach to something can protect the look and feel of some kind of invention that isn't necessarily central to the way in which the thing works. So in this way, a typeface could be applicable for a design patent. Of course, it only lasts for 15 years. So typefaces, however, while they may be eligible for design patents, can't be copyrighted. The design of letter shapes is not considered important enough or creative enough to protect, given the countervailing requirements or the countervailing value of making letters and numbers publicly available to be able to use in whatever glyph you have. Copyright's different than design patent. Copyright covers creative works for the life of the creator plus 70 years. So if a copyright was granted, the protection given the inventor of, say, a typeface would be much longer than what you could get from a design patent. Typefaces themselves can't be copyrighted. And you can see that in the electronic code of the federal regulations regarding copyright here in Title 37, I was going to say Chapter 37. Chapter 2, Subchapter A, Part 202.1, you can see that there's a specific listing of material that's not subject to copyright. And one of them is typefaces. So that said, why are fonts legally such a pain? Well, it turns out that digital fonts can be copyrighted. And they can be copyrighted as opposed to typefaces that exist outside the internet or the digital domain, because software is considered a creative work. And so there are certain formats of fonts, notably PostScript Type 1, TrueType, and OpenType formats, that describe in computer code how a font is to be constructed or rendered. Basically, it requires a lot of descriptions of Bezier curves and other control points that give the shape to the letters that are present within the fonts. These descriptions of the shape of the fonts and where these curves are considered software. And because of that, fonts that are in these formats are also considered software. And while they're not copyrightable by virtue of being typefaces, they are copyrightable by virtue of being software. So notably, bitmapped fonts, or fonts that are just described by which bits are turned on and off, as opposed to software that constructs the font when you're drawing it, are not copyrightable because there's no software there. So you think like an 8-bit font or something where it's bitmapped letters. Now, you might not be surprised to learn that the source of the decision to be able to copyright fonts was the result of a lawsuit that Adobe brought about one of its fonts. The font in question was called the Utopia font. And the Utopia font was basically stolen by another person who took the design points in the Utopia font and tweaked them very, very slightly so that while they were technically different, they didn't materially result in a different looking font. And so Adobe sued this, in this case it was a company called Southern Software, the employee that worked with that company, because they felt that that they had had intellectual property stolen from them, and they argued that because it was software, it was valid to be copywritten, and so they won the suit, and that established the precedent that software defined or fonts designed through fonts designed through software can be copyrighted. So here's an example of what the Utopia font looks like, just for reference, Font Geek reference. So from this point on, from this decision on, it became necessary to be very careful about the fonts that you use within your designs, because if you use one without permission, one that's been copyrighted, then you're legally liable for damages to the creator of that font. So this made them a pain. And so Microsoft in 1996 attempted to address this problem by creating a set of core fonts for the web. And this project the idea was to distribute a set of 10 different fonts to browsers, primarily Internet Explorer, but I believe it worked in other browsers as well. A collection of fonts that web designers could trust was going to be present on all the different computers that were running internet browsers. And in this way, designers could have some flexibility over the typefaces that they used, and as long as they were leveraging fonts that Microsoft was providing for free of charge, then they wouldn't get in trouble for using a font that they didn't have legal rights to. Notably, Comic Sans is in this collection, a widely derided font by graphic designers. So, as part of this evolution, now that there were fonts available, in CSS2 in 1998, the font face property was introduced to CSS, and eventually this became the predecessor to the font family properties that we have now. So hooray! Software fonts from a user's computer could now be used to render web pages. Microsoft had provided a bunch of them. CSS had provided a mechanism by which we could access them. But users didn't have any other fonts on their computer. And so graphic designers were limited in what they could possibly use to display their text or display their web page. And even when they did use one of the core fonts that was available to them, they often rendered differently on different browsers and on different platforms at different times. So this was a real messy situation that the web was in, that the internet designers were in. Part of this, in order to compensate for this, was the development of the font stack. And if you go through the CSS tutorial on Code Academy, for example, you'll get trained in how to do a font stack. Now, font stacks allow designers to pick a preferred font and then have possible backups in case the font that the designer wanted isn't installed on the particular computer. So for example, here's 3 selectors for a CSS cascading style sheet. The first one selects all the paragraph tags that have class choice 1. The second selects all the paragraph tags that have class equal to choice 2. And the third selects all the paragraphs that have class equal to choice 3. In the first case, the font family that is preferred for paragraphs with choice 1 class is the, I don't know how to pronounce that, Segoi UI, a particular font that the designer wanted to use. You read these left to right, so if that font isn't installed on the computer, the browser is instructed to fall back into the Segoi font. And if that isn't available, fall back to the Tahoma font. And if that isn't available, fall back to the Geneva font. And if that isn't available, fall back to the sans serif font, which is actually a collection of, it basically says any font that doesn't have serifs on it. In the second case, the preferred font is Georgia. If that's not available, Cambria, then Times New Roman, then Times, and if none of those are available, then the preference is any font that has serifs on it. And likewise in choice 3, the fallback mechanism is preferred Arial, then Helvetica, and then sans serif. So this is the font stack that was designed to kind of compensate for the fact that some of these fonts might not be available on a particular computer. Messy situation. Fonts available, don't render right, we have a font stack, all trying to make sense of the font environment as it stood at the time. Well, this continued to fail on mobile because on mobile devices, these fonts weren't ported. And in fact, a whole new set of fonts were introduced. So besides just not giving designers confidence in their designs because the mobile browser space was a completely different space with different rendering patterns, making fonts look different, a lot of the fonts weren't present. And the ones that were present were completely different. Droid Sans and Droid Serif and Roboto, that should be Roboto, not robot, on the Android platform, and more recently the San Francisco font on the iPhone platform. All of these fonts, weren't what designers were expecting when they first made their websites. So again, just another complexity in the then current situation of the font environment. So the solution then was to use embedded fonts. Embedded fonts are a way of providing instructions to the browser on where the browser should go to get a font that the designer of the HTML web page wants to have used to display the content of the document. So this is great. You can now, rather than relying on a font being installed on a user's computer, possibly not there because they didn't pay for it or didn't download it or didn't update their system, now a web designer can refer to a font that they want, the browser will download it, and then it can be used in the user's environment. There are several sources of these for designers that they can use. Here are 3 that are free. Google Fonts is one location where you can get free high-quality fonts for websites. The Adobe Edge Web Fonts platform is a source. Adobe provides some fonts free of charge and also legally permissible to use. And then there's also the Open Font Library, 3 sources of free fonts. You can also obtain paid fonts in a similar mechanism. The Type Foundry's archive will enable you to buy fonts that you can use on your web page, as does Font Shop, a location on the internet. And the Adobe Typekit also enables you to buy fonts as well. Now, the upside of buying a font is you typically get very high quality fonts. Most common characters in modern languages have been rendered. You don't have any missing characters for upside down question marks for Spanish, or ñes or umlauts or different kinds of international characters, which are sometimes missing in free fonts. You also get a full range of bold and italics and different font weights when you pay for the fonts. So those are good things. High quality fonts, they usually look good. The downside is you have to pay for them. And often you have to pay quite a bit. If you are buying a font, depends on what the licensing agreement is, but it's not unusual to have to pay a certain amount every month that you have a website running that uses that font. So maybe it's $99 a month in order to use a font for every month in which your website is running. So it can often be a subscription model as well. So and this is appropriate for some websites or some commercial enterprises. It's hard to justify for scrappy little startups. Depends on what you are. If you're a publishing organization, maybe the font is really important to you. Maybe if you're high design and you have income coming in from your website, that's worth it to you. What I want to look at, though, is a little more is the Google Fonts, the fonts that are available through the Google Fonts system. This is widely used on the internet, really high quality fonts, not everything that you might want, but freely available and with a lot of selection as well. And it's a growing collection. As of the filming of this lecture, there were over 800 royalty-free fonts available from the Google Fonts catalog. So here's 9 of them. You can see these in particular are display fonts, so they're different categories of fonts that these fonts fall into. For example, whether they're intended to be used for reading, or whether they're used for headlines, or whether they're used for handwriting simulated fonts. These are all display fonts, so they're not supposed to be used for long sections of text, but more for call-outs and headlines. So there are over 800 royalty-free fonts, and in order to include one in your website, basically what you have to do is you have to get a link to an external style sheet that you put into your HTML page, just like you were creating an external style sheet on your own for your web page. But rather than getting it from your website, you request it from Google. And because of the way the URL is constructed, Google can understand what you're requesting and will give you back the details, the font that you've asked for, that you can then reference in your CSS so that you can have the font that you want. So the basic way in which you go about this is you find the font you like by looking on the website. Once you find the font you like, you link it into your web page in the head section of your HTML, and then you reference that font in the font family property of your CSS rules. So 3 stages. Pick the font you like, download it via your link in your head of your HTML in your web page, and then use it in your CSS rules. So let's say, for example, here here's a font that I like. It's Special Elite. Kind of looks like a distressed typewriter font. And I'd like to add that to my website. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select it, and I'm going to click on the See Specimen link down there at the bottom to get some details about it. And when I do that, I can check out, the popularity of it. I can check out where regionally it's used. And one thing that I like about this interface is that it'll show me pairings of this font with other fonts. So if you look down in the bottom left, you can see how the Special Elite font is often paired with other fonts. And the text in the bottom in the center, where it says the spectacle before us was indeed sublime, is a pairing of a headline in the Special Elite font with some paragraph text in a different font. It's a suggestion for two things you might like to put together, a font palette, if you will. So I like the Merriweather font that's not being shown here, but I picked that one out as well. And I said, okay, I would like to have my website pair the Special Elite font as a headline font and the Merriweather font as a readable text font. All right, so after I select this font by clicking in the upper right, you kind of put them into a sort of a pseudo shopping cart. You're not buying them, but you're just putting them in a place to save them until you can get all the ones you want together in one place. So that's the pairings on the bottom left. And now when you do, after you've selected your font, you choose which variants you want. By that I mean what weights do you want included? So you can have a regular font size in different. You can have a font. You have to specify which sizes of the font you want. You have to specify which weights you want of the font, bold or italic. And not all of the fonts give you access to all of the things you might like. For example, some fonts have all the international characters, some don't. Some have a range of sizes, some don't. Your browser will scale it up or scale it down as best as it can. And some have bold and some don't. So you choose those variants you want, and then you ask Google to construct the URL for you that you need to use in order to put into your HTML. So here's an example of doing that. Here's the Merriweather font, and I've put them in my shopping cart. I'm going to select down at the bottom, and I'm going to customize it by picking out what I want. I'm going to get the regular and the bold Merriweather. Special Elite only has regular. Then I'm going to click on Embed in order to grab the link tag that I'm going to put into my code. And then below that, you can see the CSS properties that I need to include in order to actually render it somewhere. All right, so once you copy that line, you can then go to your HTML and you can put it in there. So here's an example of a very short HTML document. You can see that it's HTML5 from the doc type at the top. There's an outer HTML tag, and we have a head and a body section. In the head section, I've included a title for this page. It says font sample. And then I've included that link tag, which is what Google provided me in order to request the external style sheet. Now, I kept it exactly as what Google gave me, except I made one change. And that change was that between the 700 and the word special, when Google gave me the link, they gave it to me with a vertical bar in the middle of that. Now, 99% of the time, that's going to be fine. But I went ahead and converted that vertical bar into the characters %7c, which is the escape character for a URL for a vertical bar, just to make sure it's going to work in all environments. It's probably not something that you need to worry about, but if you look at this and you notice the difference, I did that manually. As you look at that URL, you can see that it's constructed like many other URLs. It's a scheme, HTTPS. It has a server that it's accessing, fonts.googleapis.com. It has what appears to be a file called CSS, and then it has some parameters and some values associated with it. And you can see that in the construction of this, you can see it's requesting the Merriweather font at sizes 400 and 700, and then the Special Elite font, where spaces have been replaced by plus signs. So if you don't want to use the tool that Google provides to construct this for you, you can manually make this URL as well. It's just a little bit detailed and prone to error if you do it yourself. Once I've included that link tag, I now have access to those fonts within my code. And so I've included an internal style sheet in the head section, and that's bracketed by the style tags. And you can see that in the style tags, I've defined two different classes, the lead class and the copy class. And I say the lead class is going to use the font family Special Elite, and then I'm going to have a fallback called cursive. Now, even though I'm downloading an embedded font in this case, and because of that, I can be confident that the user has this font available to them, I went ahead and added a catch-all fallback on the font stack, just in case for some reason the internet connection to the Google site broke. Perhaps the Google site is down briefly, or there's some sort of glitch in the network. So I did include one fallback just in case something went wrong in that regard. In addition to the lead class being a certain font family, I also gave it a font size of 300% normal. And then in the copy class, I said anything of the copy class will be of the Merriweather font, and then I also had a fallback on this font stack of serif there. Meanwhile, down in the body, I've declared two different paragraph tags, and I gave the first paragraph the class of lead. Now notice I don't have the period when I define the class. When you do it as an attribute, when you specify lead as an attribute, you just specify the word. The period is only used in the style sheets to indicate that you're talking about a class. And so the first paragraph, I'm going to apply the Special Elite font to it. And the second paragraph, I'm going to apply the Merriweather font to it. So when I render that, I get a nice website that looks maybe like a zine or something, where the headline there has been rendered in the correct font and the paragraph is in a different font. So really nice choice, a really nice ability to choose fonts. Whether or not it's a nice choice of fonts is, I guess, up to you to decide. I'm not a graphic designer. Now the other thing to worry about, though, is that requesting fonts like this uses bandwidth. And if you go into your web browser and you use the developer inspection tools like we've seen previously, and you look in the network tab and you disable caching and you refresh your web page, you can see how much bandwidth it's required in order to download that font. There's a feature of the Google Chrome inspection tab that enables you to simulate your web page loading on different kinds of networks. And so in this image, what I'm showing you is I'm showing you how you can simulate this website loading over a 3G mobile network. And when I do that, again, disable caching and reload it, you can see the amount of time that the different components take to load up. Now the font sample loads very fast because it's located on my hard drive, and so it's not even going over the network in order to get it. Nonetheless, it's a small file. But you can see that the requirement to go out to the network to get, first of all, the first request that is linked from my linked tag took 43 milliseconds. And then within that document, when it came back, there were two other resources that were referenced with those crazy names, the third and fourth one, that took, looks like 380 milliseconds and 173 milliseconds. So you can see that the loading of my web page in this case is dominated by the amount of time it takes to download the fonts. Now fortunately, those files can be cached, and so subsequent times in which you load those fonts, it'll be much faster. Furthermore, if it turns out that your website is using a font that another website is using as well, and that other website is also getting it from the same location at Google Fonts, you may benefit from the fact that another website has cached the same fonts already, and you can get a possible speed up just by piggybacking on their font as well. So the point is that don't go crazy on the fonts because they slow down your website and add to latency. There are some optimizations that you should consider when using Google Fonts. You should only download the fonts you need to minimize bandwidth. You should only download the variants you need. If you're not going to be using bold and italic and really large and really small fonts, you shouldn't download them all. And furthermore, if you really want to make a blazing fast website, and you know that you're only going to be using certain characters for a particular font, like maybe you just want one font where you're going to just put one small headline or the name of your company or something at the top of the website, then you can actually specify through an optimization in that URL which text you want to render, and then you're only going to download the renderings of the characters that you've requested. So in this case here, I've requested the Special Elite font, and I've indicated that all I want are the characters that are required to spell out this is the headline. Remember, capitalization, capital letters make a difference. So when I download that font, while I could reference that font in any CSS rule, if I tried to have content that had any letters that weren't present in the text that I specified here, I wouldn't have downloaded the characters required. I wouldn't have downloaded the information required to render those characters. I just mentioned that as an optimization if it's something that you're interested in. And if you go to the Google Font website, you'll see that there are a lot of other options of ways in which you can tweak the system to get different kinds of fonts. One other one is a trick that you can leverage, which is you can specify that when you get your font from Google, you would like a font effect applied to it before you download it. So there's probably, 40 different font effects that you can apply. And so in this case, I just showed you a few of them: neon, outline, putting green, scuff steel, and multiple shadow. And what Google will do is it will apply this effect to any font that you select if you construct the appropriate URL. And then in your class, if in addition to specifying the font, you also specify the class, for example, the top one, font effect neon, your font will render with the neon effect. So let me show you what that looks like. So notice that in this case, it's basically the same. Notice that the link tag is slightly different because after Special Elite, I added some additional characters that indicate that I would like that font to have the neon effect downloaded with it. I kept the internal style sheet the same, but down in the body of the text, the paragraph that has class lead, you can see that I added a second class called font effect neon. Now, it's one thing I'm not sure that we've said explicitly, but any tag in HTML can have multiple classes. And so in this case, there are multiple classes that are being applied to this paragraph. Both the lead class, which is going to cause the font to render in Special Elite at 300%, but also the font effect neon, which is going to cause any font in there to be rendered in neon, provided I've downloaded. So the difference now is that I get this, maybe what we would term an atrocity of graphic design, which nonetheless demonstrates a very powerful technical ability to convert your font to a neon mode before you download it. So Google Fonts are all detailed at https://developers.google.com/fonts. A lot of good information there. I'm going to have you leverage that soon. So in summary, fonts on the web used to be very hard. They're still legally fraught with some challenges if you're not careful. Google, however, has provided a way in which you can get legal fonts that are widely available and can be downloaded very quickly that will render faithfully in different browsers. So they've sort of sidestepped it by creating an environment and an ecosystem in which it's easy to do the right thing. Nevertheless, fonts do consume bandwidth, and so you have to be cautious about which fonts you include and which variants you use along the way. So I hope this has given you a little bit of insight into fonts, some of the history of fonts and how to use them, in particular how to use them from Google Fonts, and that as a result, your web pages will look awesome. Better than mine do. Please do better than I'm doing, especially with that neon font. Thank you for your attention.